Hi everyone, I'm conscious of the time, so I kind of feel that I'm gonna, I don't kind of feel, I do feel. I feel as though I'm gonna start, just kind of do some of the overall welcoming and framing remarks. And I just want to say this is the second meeting of the year of the Law and Global Health Collaboration. And my name is Sophia Gruskin, and along with Alex Capron, who's in the back, and Joe Mayer, who's in the back, and Laura Ferguson, who's sitting right here, and other members of the steering committee for the Law and Global Health Collaboration, we're very happy to welcome all of you here. I want to say a few things about the collaboration before I hand it over to David for our talk and what it is that we're going to do. What we're trying to do really is we really are trying to stimulate thinking that is going to help us move beyond our disciplinary boundaries, and so that we can learn from each other not only about new topics, but topics we already work on, but to hear about them from different angles and different disciplines. And I think that the key point that I want to make is that what we're trying to say as the collaboration is that no one comes to the table as the expert. We are all experts bringing something different to the discussion, and I think that that's really important in terms of how it is that we want to frame the way that we hear each other. And we really recognizing that we've taken on talking about the Trump administration and its policies as our focus for this year. I think one of the other things I need to say up front is that we really want to ensure that we are able to generate really respectful and evidence-based dialogue collectively, and really with the idea that this can ideally help us to set a research agenda and some sort of action agenda potentially that would be relevant to students and faculty across USC. I would ask you please, if you haven't already, to fill in the sign-up sheets that are going around, just to make sure that you hear about what we've got going in the coming months. One of the logistical things that we've been really focused on for this year is we really want to support students to get engaged in research around these topics. And we sent around a doodle poll kind of thing to all of you that, I suppose many of you who are in this room, asking what topics students really wanted to try to work on collectively across disciplines. And a number of different options came forward. And the one that got the most votes, for lack of a better term, and this was even before the news on Friday, was women's reproductive health. And so what I wanted to say is that we are going to convene a lunchtime meeting where we're going to have lunch around a table with 8 to 10 people, where we can look collectively across disciplines and sit together to think about kind of the research agenda and really go forward collectively around that topic. If that interests you, I'm going to send out another one of these emails. Please sign up for it and tell us that you want to come to that. We're planning for that to be in December. And then just one other thing is that next month, because we're really trying to hit some hot topics, next month our focus is going to be on climate change and on law and global health, and we have some phenomenal speakers coming up for that, which you will hear about by email. Okay, I want to say something about David Kaye, who's sitting right here in his lovely way. Okay, he is the UN Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of the right to freedom of expression, and has been for the past 3 years. He's also a professor at UC Irvine in human rights law, and he's also somebody who started the International Rights Program at UCLA, and founded its International Justice Clinic, and he's somebody who's been working at the intersection of human rights law and these sorts of issues for not as long as I have, but quite a long time. And we, basically, the idea of just being able to hear from him in general is really great, but to hear from him at this particular moment, at this particular time, is really phenomenal. He also happens to be an incredibly nice person. Say that as well, right? So the way that we really want to do this is that David will speak to us for about 20-25 minutes, and then we'll open it up for a general discussion. And David, with that, I think the floor is yours.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I don't know about the nice part, but my parents are from Ohio. Anybody from Ohio? People from Ohio are the nicest people. And I grew up in LA, and I think LA tried to knock the niceness out of me, but That's my parents. Anyway, thank you all for being here. I want to do a few things today, and hopefully it'll be more in the nature of generating some questions for discussion rather than providing any answers. I think that, as is true for so many global health problems, but I think particularly for issues around what we're calling fake news, and we could talk about what that actually means in a little bit, I think the issue itself is pretty difficult, both definitionally, what is it that we're talking about, but also in terms of solutions. And so I want to really try to generate some discussion around these issues, and I'll try to do it in a few different ways. One, I'll start by just highlighting the problem, which I think, particularly to an audience that's focused on global health, understands the problem of false information, generally disinformation, even propaganda, but particularly in the context of health, it's been a problem for years and years, long predates. I actually did not have Donald Trump's name in my talk, but long predates the election of Donald Trump when the hysteria over fake news really exploded. So after talking a little bit about what the problem is, and that'll just be a few minutes, I'll talk about human rights law. What's the framework that a human rights lawyer, particularly a human rights lawyer who works on freedom of expression, what's the framework for thinking about these kinds of issues? And then from that, talk about a variety of solutions to the problem. So this is a talk that's not theoretical. It's about a problem, one framework for thinking about dealing with the problem, and then finally some legal/policy options for dealing with it. Okay. So as far as the problem goes, I mean, it's obvious, right? There is so much out there, and I think certainly in the United States we've been talking about false information for many years in the context of the anti-vax movement, and there's been a lot of discussion, I think, certainly among clinicians and academics in the medical field about how to deal with that particular kind of problem. Obviously, it's not that hard to find this kind of news out there. And I just literally last night, because yesterday I told Sophia, I'm not going to do a PowerPoint, but I was kind of rooting around online. There's so many great images that I just had to use. I think I took one off that was about, it was a news item about a head transplant, which I thought was just a little bit over the top, so to speak, for this. Okay, so it's clear that false information in the context of politics, as the major discussion has arisen in the United States and around the world over the last 11, 12 months, is a very serious problem, although it's also hard to quantify. Right? It's hard to identify both the fake news and its origins, but also its impact on voting and so forth. That's been, I think, a very significant problem that has not yet been answered by academics or by others in the field as to what exactly was the impact of the spread of false information throughout 2016. I think in the context of health, we see something really quite different, right? So if you think about the anti-vax movement, a lot of the information that circulated first came in the packaging of real information. It was very hard for an ordinary non-medical person or non-scientist to distinguish. But also it was quantifiable in the sense that you could identify the numbers of people who were not getting vaccinated, the numbers of parents who were not having their children vaccinated. But you can also imagine fake news in the context of hysteria, right? So this was an item that was circulating and circulated pretty rapidly and in a widespread way across social media over the last few years during the Ebola outbreak in Africa, and there was a fear that it was here. I'm just going to give you some examples for fake news that's out there related to the anti-vax movement. As over the last several years, particularly it's true if anybody has teenage children, where you started to be introduced to the HPV vaccine. There was a lot of disinformation, and this was just one random search that was conducted, I think, about a year ago, and that search pulled up 5 different items, and 3 of these items, which for the uninitiated do not look distinguishable from the others, are about hysteria over the HPV virus, right? And these were fake items. These were items that were not based on science, but were based on fears of the impact of HPV. And you can just look at one of them. So the second one says, lead developer of HPV vaccines comes clean, warns parents and young girls, it's all a giant deadly scam. Okay, not true, but and the search results showed up pretty high here. Now, here's Zika, right? So this item looks real, right? It not only looks real, it looks like it's a BBC headline, right? It could be a BBC story. But of course, if you look down here in the corner, it's oi, oi. It should be oi. I have a feeling it's oye, but it's oi. It's like oi vey news or something like that. But right, it's about just setting the scene in a way for people to be doubtful about a real health problem, really a health epidemic that had very significant implications for individuals. I think this had a particular implication for people at the time that it came out because there was still quite a bit of uncertainty. The CDC was exploring just what impact Zika had on the illness that children were facing. So sometimes it can be very impactful in a way. And I think this will be the last one I'll show. So this is just we see this particularly in the context of information about essential oils. There's actually a very interesting article in the New Yorker this week about essential oils, if you saw that. And it really talks about sort of this intersection of both salesmanship and propaganda, right? So people want to sell their item, and overselling. Here is this smart drug, the most powerful brain enhancer in the world. I mean, that's clickbait if I've ever seen it. But of course, if you looked up at the URL, it's not the real NBC News website. So it looks like NBC News. It's presented as NBC News, but it's a fake URL up on top. Okay. So, I did leave this one up here, only because that's kind of great. Although, so this is like an onion style kind of headline. So this is another element of fake news for us to think about is, how do we distinguish between fake news and satire? I'll actually talk a little bit about that toward the end. But there actually is apparently a doctor in Italy who has been working on head transplant. Who knows? Maybe I've been duped myself. So. Okay, so clearly it's been an issue. Health news is one of the most sort of regularly circulated kind of news. If you go to any news site that you actually look at and look at the the sidebar for most popular, it's regularly about health issues. People are always in the market for health news, and I think for that reason are susceptible to false claims, right? And this was a story in The Independent that just goes through some information, some research showing how misinformation, and I would say disinformation. Misinformation has a sense, I think, of maybe inadvertent, whereas disinformation has a more willful sense to it, is the kind of information when we're talking about health that circulates really quite rapidly on Facebook, on Twitter, and other social media. Okay, so I don't think I have to say anything more about the problem. It's clearly an issue out there. Anybody who gets news items sent by a relative knows that this is right. Everybody gets that op-ed that my mother sent from Ohio. I said so. Anyway, she's sending me these things all the time. I want us to think a little bit about how we deal with it. Okay, so I think for many of us, and I think this is true, and my father's a physician, so I know this is true at least among my sample of one. When we see information that can actually, in a very obvious sense, have a real harmful effect, whether it's cause a hysteria or deter people from getting treatment that they might otherwise that they might otherwise get, that one of our reactions to that might be a kind of censorship. Right? That kind of information is so harmful. It's harmful not only to individual health, but it can be harmful to public health, that we need to find ways to keep that information out of the public space. I get that, and to a certain extent, I share that. But what I want us to think a little bit about is how we might think about that particular kind of motivation of ours within the context of law. And rather than think about it in the context of First Amendment law, I want to think about it in the context of human rights law, because that's my mandate from the UN. I could talk a little bit about the mandate afterwards if people have questions, but I really just want to get into the problem. Okay, so this is the framework that those of us who practice freedom of expression law as a matter of human rights law deal with, right? So this is Article 19 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. It really is widely seen as the central human rights treaty for civil and political rights. It has a sibling treaty, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which doesn't have as much bite, I would say, as the ICCPR, but together they form essentially the corpus of human rights law, often referred to as the International Bill of Rights. Okay, so Article 19, which is binding on the United States ratified it in 1992, first protects everyone's right to have an opinion. We're going to sort of skip over that today. Article 2, everyone shall have the right to freedom of expression. That means freedom to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers. That regardless of frontiers, I think, is interesting in a couple of reasons, but one is that as a matter of human rights law, it's a transboundary right. So which is unusual in human rights law. Most human rights law is territorial. Article 19 suggests I have the right to get information, from anywhere, across borders, national borders as well, and then through any media of one's choice. Which that last part, through any media, suggests that this is a perfectly drafted provision for the digital age, right? It's pretty clear that the framers of the ICCPR adopted in 1966, but this language actually comes from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, that they were thinking ahead, right? That it was actually kind of an act of humility, right? They don't know all of the ways in which information might be shared in the future, so this is going to apply to any media. I think of this provision, Article 19.2, as brilliant in a way, right? And compare it in your mind to First Amendment. Right? First Amendment says Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. Right? It's very much directed to what the government cannot do, right? Which is how our Bill of Rights is framed. It's a constraint on state behavior. But here this is flipped around, and this is about the individual's right. Right? So it's about the individual's right to seek and receive information, which could mean, if we're talking about any media, we could be talking about the digital age. It's the right to browse, right? The right to search, the right to connect with people through social media, whatever it might be. And it's also the freedom to impart, right? So it kind of collects all of the ways in which you think of sharing and receiving information in a way that the First Amendment doesn't quite capture, even though First Amendment law has obviously developed over time to capture most of these elements. Okay, so the right is clear. One key point about the right is it doesn't say how shall the right to seek, receive, and impart true information. Right, so there's no implication here that this is limited to truth or falseness, satire, insults, you name it. This is about all information, right? Information and ideas of all kinds. I love Article 19 too. Now, here's the provision that is not quite as lovable, I don't think. But from the perspective of dealing with health problems and health information, false health information, it might actually be a useful framework for thinking about restrictions. So the three key parts of Article 19.3, which deals with the restrictions on 19.2. So opinion cannot be constrained, but expression can be by the state. It requires three different elements, right? So one, it has to be provided by law. So if you have a restriction, provided by law generally means it can't just be the executive deciding on a whim I'm going to prohibit this kind of expression. But it also means, and it's been interpreted over the years by the Human Rights Committee, which is the monitoring body for the ICCPR, it's been interpreted to mean also that law needs to be clear and precise. It can't provide excessive discretion in the executive so that it's a loose piece of law, but the executive could do essentially anything within its context. So that's the provided by law part. You need to have that as your first condition. Second condition is that any restriction has to be necessary. It's been interpreted generally to be necessary and proportionate. So whatever restriction you adopt, it has to be necessary, and it has to be for a particular purpose. And the purposes are for the respect of the rights or reputations of others. So you could think of things like privacy. So health law, particularly in the context of private health information, right, that can be restricted under this framework as a protection of some order or public health or morals. We're not going to go down the path of morals. That's one of these the words, you look at a treaty or a law and you just wish you didn't go down that road. But anyway, public health, right? So we could think about some of those problems that were identified in my initial slides, right? So the hysteria over an Ebola outbreak in New York City, or the information about false information about Zika that might frame the way people behave, either in their travel or in the precautions they take or whatnot. If the state can make a case, right, that under its law that it's necessary somehow to restrict the dissemination of that information, right, to protect public health, this would provide that kind of framework. Okay, I think it's a legitimate way to think about some public health problems, but I think the key point is not necessarily that it's a public health element, but it's a question of necessity and proportionality, right? And that's essentially where the rest of my focus will be and the rest of my remarks here. But I think this is the hard part, right? Because so often when we think about what's necessary to protect, let's say, public health, although I often, frankly, in most of the problems globally around these issues focus on national security or public order right now in terms of state laws, to be honest, we tend to focus on the necessity element, right? So is it necessary to take this restrictive step in order to protect this legitimate public interest? And oftentimes it's hard to prove necessity, right? There may be other steps that you might take. Maybe it's more information. Maybe it is other kinds of education processes that might work to undermine the false news itself so that you don't have to go down the path of censorship. Then there's the issue of proportionality, right? In which case it may be that censoring information doesn't eliminate the information, right? It just pushes it into a place that may be harder to find, but still circulates in spaces that we don't know about. So that may make it harder for public health professionals to actually deal with the false news, right, if you don't see it. So there are a lot of problems around restricting information, and I think you can see them particularly in the case of public health. Okay, so that's the framework. So just keep this framework in mind maybe as we go to think about some of the problems. So what I want to do now is try to address 3 or 4 different ways in which we might think about dealing with information, in this context obviously health information, that might be problematic and that you might want to restrict its dissemination. What are the possible approaches? In thinking about those approaches, the way I tend to think of these issues is, how are we going to maintain respect and advance the cause of freedom of expression, right, in 1902, while also protecting the equity in 1903? And I think in many cases that's a very hard balance. And I think that we're not always succeeding in doing that. I think in the fake news issue, fake news context generally, we're probably not doing a very good job right now at managing that balance. Okay, so one approach, an approach that I think is probably the most consistent with freedom of expression law and the principles of freedom of expression, is to check that false news or allegedly false news with true information. And that can come in a variety of contexts. One possibility is an organization like Snopes. And Snopes, probably many, if not all of you, are familiar with Snopes. Snopes.com is basically a fact-checking organization. There are other fact-checking organizations around the world that have picked up over the last really 1 to 2 years. But the idea behind them is we don't want to be in the place where we're censoring information. We want to be in the place where, in a kind of marketplace of ideas framework, right? The marketplace of ideas being something that Justice Louis Brandeis more or less invented over a century ago, that in that context, we want ideas to challenge ideas. And the best way to shoot down or to deal with a false idea or false information is to show to an audience that it's not true. And that's something that Snopes does. And you can see this is kind of the typical way in which they do this. They have a rating. This is similar to the fact-checking, the PolitiFact that we see that's done with respect to politicians all the time in the United States. There's a rating. There's a question, what's true in the information? So the claim is up at top, dandelion root can kill 98% of cancer cells in 48 hours. Would that it were true. What's true in that? There's some anecdotal evidence, so there's some sense that they're not simply rejecting the claim altogether. There might be something out there, but what is false about it? And in a very quick way, there's a suggestion, here's what's wrong with this information. Now, the problem, of course, is, Snopes doesn't go viral, which is a great word in a public health context. It doesn't go viral in the same way that that the other information goes viral. The other information, this is part of the problem with false information and disinformation. Oftentimes, it's information that we want to hear, right? Psychologically, we're looking for an answer. What is? Oh, there's a new cure for cancer, and it'll work in 48 hours, and I don't have to go through chemo or all of the terrible things that one has to go through when one has cancer. No, you could just get it through this dandelion root, which you can get at your health food store around the corner. So we're attracted to that, and this doesn't conquer the internet, right? In the way that false information tends to conquer the internet. But this is important, and we'll come back to some of the, and maybe in Q&A as well, come back to a little bit more about why this may not work all the time. Okay, a second approach is to think about fake news and solutions in the context of technology. Okay, I think this is a very real possibility, much as the truth can conquer falsity. At the same level, we could also talk about what is it that technology companies, which are today the main conduit for false information, largely, what can they do? So the New York Times, in this post-election last November, was very much a part of a hysteria. I thought of it as a hysteria, almost like an outbreak in public health, but it was like a public information hysteria. Not to say that the fake news issue was purely hysterical. It's a real problem, as I think the information on health, those slides at the beginning may have indicated. But the question is, what can the technology companies do? And there's going to be a broader question I want to ask right after this. So, one possibility is that it's the tech companies that are responsible. So here, Time said a big part of the responsibility for this scourge rests with internet companies like Facebook and Google. I don't know why they saved Twitter from this, which have made it possible for fake news to be shared nearly instantly with millions of users and have been slow to block it from their sites. That is true, right? That's quite evidently true that information is circulating quickly and virally and to sort of great scope on these social media sites. Now, there's a bunch of different possibilities for dealing with that, right? And what the Times suggested was, throw algorithm into your editorial and you'll certainly scare people. For good reason. Algorithms, generally speaking, are closed to the public, so they're designed by the companies, but what actually feeds into them is there's a significant lack of transparency around those. So the Times suggested this, and I think this part is what's interesting. Surely its programmers can train the software to spot bogus stories and outwit the people producing this garbage. Okay, when I was kind of with this editorial until I got to this point, because I think there's overconfidence in what the technology companies can do. Overconfidence in a number of ways, and one that struck me as particularly problematic in this idea that, well, we should just ask the tech companies to do it, is this idea that programmers can identify fake information, false information. But how can you develop an algorithm or a filter that would filter out, information that, particularly in a public health context, information that is maybe currently subject to peer review, let's say, and has not been proven true, from satire, from information that is purposefully circulating that is false. How would we train an algorithm to figure those kinds of things out? My concern about this is overregulation, right? We'll end up excluding from public space information that actually serves to satisfy none of those elements of Article 19.3, right? National security, public order, public health, and so forth. So I think this is actually a problem to think that it's something that can just be solved by the technology companies. But there's a broader problem here as well, and this is the problem of that goes well beyond global health, and that is what law applies to internet, to content on the internet. Should they be regulating content, right? So if you think about it, right, the United States government would be very hard-pressed to find a legal basis to censor information. In fact, I think it would be impossible for it, as a matter of law, to censor the information that I was suggesting might be circulating in those initial slides, right? That's just not a power that's available to the US government. And the truth is that's not a power we tend to think exceptionally that we've got this First Amendment and nobody else has restrictions, but most other countries do too, and they should be rooted in Article 19. And even under Article 19, remember, it's a restriction, it's a right to all information, right? Information and ideas of all kinds. So the restriction has to be found to be necessary and proportionate to meet its objective. And very often, for false information, a state won't have the legal basis to restrict that information. So we're asking companies to do that instead of governments. And so a question, I think, arises, a question maybe more for discussion than anything else, because it's probably several law review articles in this question. But the question is, what law applies in digital space? Should we expect that companies are applying freedom of expression law in human rights law, First Amendment law, or should, as they do now, apply terms of service and community standards that are really about maintaining a certain kind of brand and a certain kind of communication on their sites? The way they regulate content now is disconnected from human rights law or First Amendment law. And I think as these platforms grow in size and essentially overtake the public square, so they become the public square, I think it's important for us to be asking what rules should be applying in this space, and also the impact on our own law and our own culture of thinking about freedom of expression if so much of our expression is mediated by norms that are far lower than First Amendment or human rights norms. Okay, so then a third approach, right? So I've suggested one is sort of a fact-checking approach, meet false information with truth. A second is technology companies can do it. A third possibility is impose liability on the companies, right, which is what we call intermediary liability. So impose liability on the companies when the companies allow expression that the state deems either illegal or in some other way deems prohibited and not subject to be circulated, right? So information that should be censored, let's say. So Germany, just over the summer, and just became effective on October 1st, passed the NetzDG law, which does not apply to to health news. It applies mainly to hate speech and other forms of speech that are illegal under German law. What it does is it says to the companies, you need to, within different time frames, I won't get into the details, you need to take down that information as soon as you're notified of it, either within 24 hours or 7 days. And if you fail to meet that obligation, we will fine you up to 50 million euros. Okay, so this puts the company into basically into the perspective of being, or into the role of being the censor itself. So that is a possibility. That is another approach, right? Impose liability on the companies to do this. It requires changing one's national law to do it. But it includes all of the risks that I talked about for company regulation as well. It doesn't change any of those risks. Now, another form of regulation, so this would be the fourth possible kind of regulation, would be to actually criminalize the sharing of false information. Now, I am not recommending that, far from it, but I did want to use this as just an example because I think generally, and this goes well beyond the health news context, there is clearly a strong push. I haven't seen data on public opinion, but I would guess that public opinion on this is very strongly in favor of imposing some sorts of restrictions on the sharing of false information. I'm just guessing. I don't know if that's true, but I think just from our own discussions with our own, cohort, we probably hear this kind of suggestion from time to time. What I just want to suggest here is there actually is a criminal version of the spreading of false news that's actually around the world. I would say that probably a majority of states have this kind of criminal law. So in the Gambia, although the Gambia is changing because they had a change of government, thankfully, you could be charged with sedition and the publication of false news. And that was a journalist in the Gambia. In Bahrain, this was a political activist who was charged with spreading false news, false rumors. In Egypt, this particular case that I'm identifying had to do with the Al Jazeera journalists. You might have remembered were held by Egypt for almost 2 years, a few years ago, and they were charged with broadcasting false news. Thailand, this was a case involving a British human rights lawyer who did work on labor standards and human rights in Thailand, was initially sued for defamation by a company, and then the government accused him and charged him of broadcasting false statements. So if we go down the path of regulating false news, particularly if we go down the path of prohibiting or criminalizing it, my fear is that this is our future. So we need to be really careful about how we do this. Okay, so I'm going to just conclude here with a few points, and then I'll leave them up so that we can have some discussion about any of these issues. So one way forward, I think, is private tech. Okay, so when I was talking about the tech companies, I may have been overstating the sense that they can't do anything. That's not true. There are things that technology companies should be doing, and I think that since last November, they understand the public outcry over false information, at least the public outcry on one side of the political spectrum, and they're attempting to a certain extent to deal with it. And I think that particularly with the news over the last few weeks over advertising and Facebook, I think we're really heading towards a place where the companies fear regulation, and it's that regulatory push and the appearances before Congress that are driving them to start to do things. Although that too is a very US-centric approach. Okay, so one thing is algorithmic and automation. So companies are working right now on how to deal with the algorithm so that you don't, if you click on fake news, you're not just served more fake news. And how you deal with that is a problem that the companies are trying to address. Another is filters. I generally think filters are really problematic because essentially content filters, are a form of censorship. And so that might ultimately undermine public debate, particularly over health issues, in ways that could be problematic. I think there's not enough user autonomy and control on site, so the tech companies don't often share with us enough, certainly enough information about where, say, the URL is from. So if you do a search, remember that HPV search that had the top 3 were false news items. I think it was actually the same item that was repackaged in different ways, but it gives the impression of being truthful when it reappears. If there was a way, and again, companies are working on this, to highlight this is a URL that was just created. This is a URL that is not a trusted site. That's problematic also, but there are things that are of the flagging nature that companies could be doing to give us more control over figuring out what's truthful and what's false. And then finally on the private tech, they're notoriously opaque. There's nobody outside of the companies who can really tell you what feeds into their algorithms in deciding what kind of information actually goes viral, and how it goes viral and what we see in our bubbles. They need to be more transparent. They need also to hold themselves more accountable for the spread of information and particularly where information may involve some kind of harm. Okay, a second way forward might be regulatory, but I think that the regulatory approaches generally are dangerous. And if we are going to go down that path, we need to be thinking about how we avoid intermediary liability, because in my view and my kind of study of the development of the digital sector over the last 20 years, it's been the lack of liability for third-party content that has been one of the greatest engines for innovation in that space, and I think we want to continue that. But how we weigh that with the spread of false information is quite frankly, a trick. Then, of course, we need to avoid censorship. I do think that to the extent that we use fake news as a mantra to censor information, there will be particular harms in the health sector in terms of shooting down false information, making it very difficult to find, but also across sectors of information, whether we're talking about politics, other areas of government policy or whatnot. So any regulatory approach needs to avoid censorship. I think one area where regulation might be of some value is for there to be government requirements. If you think about the SEC, for example, and the way in which companies that are public need to be public about their shareholders, their information, and so forth, I could imagine a legitimate role for government-imposed transparency on the companies. Maybe even transparency imposed on issues related to things like algorithms and automation, or on reporting requirements, so that the companies actually tell us what kind of information is being taken down. And then finally, and this is the easiest and the hardest, right? It's the easiest because this isn't about restriction. But I do think that there needs to be more funding for actors out there like Snopes, others that are doing the handling of fake information or false information online. There needs to be more funding for public health generally, and the public health information side of public health. Because in the face of this kind of information and the potential dangers around it, there should be more information available to people. I don't think we can rely only on clinicians to do that work, because it's a side job generally for clinicians. There needs to be a real active and well-resourced approach to the kind of information we get from CDC and other major public health outfits that promote information and then finally promote education. And I think generally speaking, of course, education around health is not always ideal, and I would include that within the kind of information about public health and news, that there needs to be education that isn't only about health, but it's also about, and this is a generational issue, I think, is about educating people about how to be news consumers and information consumers, how to be literate in a world that's changed, right? From when we just had print and got the LA Times in the morning, which even 30, 40 years ago was mostly advertisements, but No, I still love Dale. I don't know why I did it at the LA Times. But whether it's how to read the news and how to distinguish false from true information, but how to be a participant in sharing information. So I'm going to close there, and I'm happy to take any questions. And I can just run the Q&A, and I'll just open it up to questions right now. So.
But thank you.
Yeah, Hannah first. Maybe I'll take a few questions first, and then I'll check in.
So thank you so much for that. Really informative. I just got my brain working in multiple different directions on things that I don't spend a lot of time thinking about, so appreciate it. I wanted to push back a little bit with regard to your stance about a regulatory response vis-a-vis fake news from a public health perspective, actually. So when you think about Article 19.3 of the ICCPR, where public health is explicitly listed as a potential reason that there might be necessity or perhaps regulation, I would perhaps posit, and that you can maybe do it proportionally, is in thinking about the psychological manipulation that goes along with a lot of this fake news issue. And I'm thinking in particular about what you said with regard to how it looks like a lot of fake news is, of course, driven by profit, right? And driven by individuals looking to make a buck, and regardless of what the impact's going to be on the public and the public interest. And that, you know, in the publishing of this fake news, that perhaps, well, I've had talks with friends who are psychologists, and they tell me that when they go on Facebook and they go on different forms of social media, they can tell, I mean, in fact, psychologists are hired, right, as experts to help the tech companies in their building of these algorithms and what gets us to click, and, you know, what's the clickbait. And so what's the connection here, I guess? I'm wondering if there's an argument to be made for regulation in the public health interest, where we are actually using psychologists to manipulate us, actually.
Yeah, it's a great question. Maybe I'll take a few, and then I'll come back to them. Yes.
I think my question comes at this in a slightly different way, and that is 2 points. One on the law. Since Section 2 talks about seeking information, receiving information, and that aspect of the rights presumably is also covered by the restrictions can be imposed in Section 3. And since we know that, for better or worse, there is a large degree of skepticism in large parts of the public about being told what is true and false by experts. And I suspect that your objection to the word morals at the end of Section 3, which reflects a different view of what the role of the state was previously, reflects the liberal view that people shouldn't tell us what's right and wrong in a moral sense. There is a lot of discussion in the scientific community today about the fact that the kind of material that Snopes would happily say is substantiated because it's published in a peer-reviewed journal is not reproducible. An amazing amount of scientific results, peer-reviewed, clinical trials, basic research, and so forth, turns out not to be reproducible by other scientists. And we don't yet know how much of this is that the people doing the studies in some subtle, conscious or unconscious way had their finger on the scale or whatever. Now, the public distrust hasn't caught up with that information, that recognition within the scientific community of some problems in our own house. But when it does, I would think that the argument of people to say that anything that asks the government to regulate, and to say if someone has a self-interest, as scientists themselves have, in having things published and having things out there, you're going to have real problems. And you're going to have problems not only with the dissemination side, but with the seeking side. People who say, I want other information. I've been told that the vaccines don't have any harmful effects. Well, I was told for a long time that the way to health was a low-fat diet. And it turned out it was the sugar industry that was sponsoring that research and getting everybody to take the fats out, and then guess what? I won't buy the food until you put lots of sugar into it. So, this, to me, there isn't a black and white fake news thing here at all. And the label fake news can clearly apply to somebody, as Hannah says, somebody for their own interest is playing on our whatever, and 10,000 people in New York exposed to Ebola, buy your cure here or whatever, or close the borders to West Africa, or whatever it is. But you see, it's incredibly difficult to know where you draw a line when truth and falsity have no one sure judge.
Yeah, no, I agree. So I'll take one more, but I think that we only have about 2 minutes and we'll be kicked out.
And ideally
Maybe
a student.
I'm going to take a student. Your
I'm a
student.
journalism student. And
Okay,
I do
great.
want to know, what do you think is the line between censorship and regulating those things?
Yeah. So these are all great questions, and I actually think these questions highlight the problem of regulation in this space. So one thing is, if we're talking about whether it's psychologists who are involved in helping sell fake information or oversell information that is or is not truthful or might be on the line. There are certain kinds of requirements actually that are freedom of expression oriented requirements that are under Food and Drug Law, for example, and those do restrict what companies can say. So I think that there's ample space for regulation, particularly if we can identify the necessity for doing so in this space. So I'm not saying that there's no scope at all for any regulation of this kind of expression, but I do think it's I think we're in a place where it's almost like a competition for information and a marketplace competition. In what might be a broken market in many respects. I'd spend more time on that, but I think I know we're gonna get invaded here in a second, or be displaced. I think your question is, the way your comment frames in a way my problem also, that this is, on the one hand, there's information that could be fraudulent or very obviously disinformative, that is it comes from a perspective of conflict, meaning it's about money making and advantage taking and those kinds of things. But I agree. I think that for a large amount of, and this goes beyond health and goes to science more generally, science is about the hypothesizing of solutions and the disproof of them, and to a certain extent, I think in the freedom of expression world, we try to imagine ourselves as if this is a petri dish, and there's some scientific underpinnings for what we're doing, and the truth will win out, much as it should in the context of science. And that idea, I think, underlies a lot of what my concern is here, but I see there's, we're talking about gray zones for a lot of this information, which I think maybe at the end of the day, and my final comment would be, the state isn't in a position to make these calls because they will over-regulate in this space. And the difference between censorship and other forms of regulation, I think, for me, censorship is very clearly disabling people from having access to information at sort of its core definition. And wherever we see that, we need to demand from the state or if it's companies an explanation for why that is. Too often we don't get that explanation. That's unfortunate where we are. So I think where we are is at the end.
Is there a out there? Okay, can we just thank you very much?
And I want to thank Sophia Greskin, who's awesome, for inviting me here, and thank you all for being here.
And we will not be kicked out right away.
Oh, really? We thought
They're
there's
there.
people. There's people.
I don't think there's a class in here.
Okay. Now we'll find out.
If we're knocking down, everybody should grab themselves some food. Are we kicked out?
No.
Oh, good.
I asked them, they said they are not taking
Okay.
this.
All right, well, if we need to, do you mind if we take one or two more questions?
Yeah, no. And if you have to leave, you have to leave, I guess.
Okay.
I won't take it personally.
Undergraduates make a class.
Thank you very much.
One uses one.
Thank you. I come from the School of Dramatic Arts, so we're in the process of trafficking false narratives all the time. Hopefully for good things, which makes it a challenge.
Deeper truth.
What's that?
Deeper truth.
Deeper truth, yeah. Oh, perhaps. But for us, I'm curious about this is a problem not of, I think it's a problem of origin. How you're understanding this is a problem is a fictional narrative the problem of the sender, or is it a problem of the receiver? And I think it might be complexly both, but if we're imagining, as we seem to do, that's a problem of the sender, we need to shut things down and close it off, then we have fascist states, and we've seen that all over the world. In my business, largely it's a problem of the receiver, and you're into education. And for me, looking at foods that I buy, I have to see it certified by the FDA. There's a whole label on the outside of cans that didn't used to exist, that now exists, that lets me know these beans contain X, Y, and Z. And if they don't, somebody's going to be liable. I feel like it would be really useful on Facebook and Twitter to have little labels like, like the side effects may include, that soft voice of like, this may not be true. This comes from Breitbart. So
well, and we've already seen some efforts at that, and that, I mean, my principal problem with that is how do we evaluate
efficacy, true.
Right? How do we advocate the origins? Like, how do we advocate the speaker? Evaluate the speaker, the person providing the information.
How do you legitimize? But we do it all the time. I mean, like in universities, gathering, tenure track has become a problem. Let's say I'm an artist and I'm in a research-based institution that mostly favors scientific evidence,
right.
and the artist practitioners have a tough time getting tenured, but that's changing.
So I think that that's part of what the companies are starting to try to do, which is, is there a way that they can provide more information to the receiver so that they can evaluate without providing value judgments about so are there neutral indicators that a person can identify? So for example, a URL that was created a week or 6 weeks ago might be less trustworthy for someone than the New York Times website or something like that, right? So if we can, and I think that's part of the process of flagging to provide more information along these lines, because I don't think we want either government, and I certainly don't want the companies to be in the business of telling us this is a legitimate or illegitimate news source, but I might want them to tell us, where is this URL from? So like indicators that would be applied across the board to all sites, for example. So I think that would be, but those kinds of labeling, I think that's where we're headed. But again, if government starts to do it, my concern is that they get into making the judgments about value, right? The failing New York Times would get a certain, kind of judgment, right? So.
Thank you. I'm sorry that I came late. Coming from engineering side takes a long time when I was slow. I have a question about the automation and algorithm, which was very enlightening, your comment. I preface that with this thing I heard from my former student that was a very senior guy at Yale. He said that one of the biggest hiring that they have at Yale is not simply for computer programmers, and that they hire a lot of mathematicians, very advanced people with math degree, to develop algorithms for them to weed out, to vet all these comments that they put on the ad. And he said that algorithm and machine learning protocols that they develop has been very successful and very fruitful. I want to ask the question, wouldn't you think it would be easier for the fake news type of thing to develop those? Because at least in the case of fake news, you have a reference point. You can check if there is a piece of parallel in Washington, D.C. that they do child abuse and they do slavery and that. Whereas in the case of Yelp, somebody says as fake news that this restaurant, the food was rotten, it was too salty, and that you don't have that reference point.
Yeah.
Don't you think that this algorithm can eventually, and machine learning can be done more successfully for weeding out the fake news than the Yelp is using?
You know, it's a really good question. I wouldn't use the word weeding out. I don't think that will be possible. I think that it may be possible over time to frame false information in the way that we're talking about before. But I'm not sure that the same algorithmic tools, the machine learning that drives these sites that are really about subjective taste will have the same impact, and also may not pose the same kinds of problems when we're talking about information, straight information about truth and falseness. So Yelp works really well, at least in my anecdotal experience. It works well in part because they're not purely algorithmic, right? So you can see their ranking system, and both the rankings and the way you filter. So this goes to user control. The way you filter what you're looking for actually will present to you more of what you might be interested in. So it requires a kind of input that if we're talking about going on to Google and doing a straight out search, doesn't necessarily have that unless you do advanced search and you're looking for particular things, and it might, in that process of controlling your search, it might weed out, it might actually be identifying for the machine what you're not looking for and what you are looking for.
I thought what Dr. Biscotti was talking about was Yelp putting a filter on what it includes in the database. So yes, you'll see anything that you asked to see, but some things that were submitted, it regards as false information. Either the owner is peppering the site with great reviews, or someone has a revenge on them, and they're making up all these people to say
so that's
I mean, so and then it would take a long time, or thousands of Pakistani children to go through and read all those things and decide which ones are false, but you can get a machine to do it.
So so that right.
Thank you. That's that.
that's clear.
And
So I thought
filtering
your comment I thought was going to be that you wouldn't weed it out. You would do what finally the major news organizations started doing sometime this year, but didn't do during the campaign. Statement. There is no basis for this statement. In other words,
that's okay, but that's not going to be. That's possible at the at the level of the New York Times as an editor.
Well, Snopes.
Right?
Snopes says.
But Snopes does maybe 2 or 3 stories a day.
Oh yes, but I mean, I think the idea was if any site, if Facebook is passing things on to people or something, but it includes the tagline, from an unknown Russian website, or from a housewife in Ohio, very reliable, or says there's no basis for this. So children being held for a sex ring in a pizzeria in Washington. There's no basis for this.
No, we can make this conversation.
No, I was going to say, there's a question in the back, and then I have a question too.
Okay, so anyway, this is I think this is a really valid point, but I also think that the way you've elucidated it also and expanded it in a way also sheds light on how it would be very difficult to do in an information space. So in the context of Yelp, Yelp, they do have, I think the stakes are a bit lower, But I think that they do have, there's essentially a competition there. And there's one of the requirements, from what I understand, and I don't know how Yelp works all that well, but there's a lot of notice involved, right? So it's the responsibility often for the owner of the business to identify and to report to Yelp. Now, you can do that, and that can also teach and help sort of flag this site as a target of fake information or abusive information. That might be possible in a false information context as well, but I think it's just a lot harder because of the nature in which information spreads. I mean, for a lot of this, I think that the focus on Facebook, Google, and Twitter is to a certain degree misplaced, in the sense that, yes, those are important conduits for the sharing of information, but they're not alone. So, you know, if it's Yelp just managing its own site, or if it's Facebook, which could clearly do some of this, I think where we'd end up is, one, probably the exclusion of a lot of legitimate information, which may be a risk we're worth taking, but it also will simply shift that to other sites that might be more, might be more sort of filter bubbled of them on their own already. So it doesn't necessarily solve the broader problem of fake information and the sharing of false information. But that said, I mean, I think you're onto a good point, which is some of that learning from the more economic-oriented and retail-oriented and taste-oriented sites actually, I think, can be learned and are being learned by some of the information-oriented sites as well. Yeah. So, yeah. Thanks.
In the early years of a new disease, or a disease that has been around for a while but has mutated to become somewhat newish, there's really very little hard information that's known, and that's not simply by the public, that's by doctors and scientists who are not doctors who treat patients, who are actually the ones that assemble, information. And those things change, they change very rapidly. So while some things that are being disseminated may be outright falsehoods, there's other things that are in an iffy sort of area, and they change very rapidly. When scientists are not talking to the public, when they're medical scientists, but not doctors who treat people, when they're not talking to the public, when they're in a room like this or larger among themselves, they are pretty straightforward and fearless about saying, let's say, for example, AIDS is nearing its 40th year or something. So people who were early in the research and now have residents and postdocs working for them will stand up and say, this is what we thought in 1983, and they'll put up graphs. This is what we began to see was an approximation of the truth in 1990. This is when we started to make the cocktails that let people survive a little bit longer, and these are the results that we had, and this is how it changed. Scientists are fearless about saying, because scientists understand that they're in the business of making mistakes, and that it clarifies as it goes on. The public thinks that every mistake is a lie, or every early piece of information is, and even, okay, so if you have somebody who doesn't seem to be a jerk, who is communicating online. Let's say that there's a minor outbreak. A doctor has a practice here, and his office is on Jefferson and Vermont. So he sees, a bunch of flu cases he sees there's no flu cases in his area. So he reports there's no flu cases in my area. But he's a doctor, he has a single practice. So a person might say, I give more value to the input of this doctor because he is a doctor and he's been in practice for 27 years now. But it's the people who know what's coming in, it's other people, the people who put large amounts of information together, who know that a flu virus is passing through Southern California at large.
Right.
They may know that there are cases reported in Riverside, there are cases reported in Thousand Oaks, or there are cases reported in
Sure.
Encinitas or
Yeah.
something. And that doctor, who you're putting a great deal of value on his opinion, he's not lying, he's simply telling you that you're on Jefferson and Hoover, he hasn't had
Right,
any cases
right, for
reported.
sure. And that's, I mean, I think that's a basic problem with, going back to what kind of information people are looking for, right? So that kind of information might spread very easily and be used for purposes. This is something that obviously predates the digital age, right? I mean, rumors are like as human as it gets. So people might use that. I don't know if, Sophia, you were going to intervene on this also.
I'm not on that. I have a law question for you.
Okay.
So one of the things that's always bothered me about Article 19,
Mhm.
right, is the fact that there's an obligation to allow people to seek, receive, and impart. There's no obligation on anybody to give. And so the fact of where obligation resides
Yeah.
in the giving of information, when we start
Yeah.
talking about fake news, is really interesting to me because the article stays away from that issue in a way, and I just wonder how you grapple with that.
So, I mean, that's a really interesting question. And what ends up happening, so I don't know if you're getting to, so we tend to talk, so the right to seek, receive, and impart information has, over time, if you think about sort of the common law of Article 19, been interpreted to also include the freedom of information. So, in other words, the right of access to information held by public authorities. And so freedom of information law sort of falls in this context, but you're right, it's about what I can get from the government. It's not about what the government's obligations are to us. So there has been a movement over the last several years to try to reframe that a little bit, or to add to that frame, and to make it more like, given this right, what is and I actually have a research assistant working on this, right? What is the positive obligation of the state to create an environment that's conducive to freedom of expression? And so there has been a little bit of movement on that. And so I didn't talk much about my mandate, but so as one of the things that I do with, there's 3 other rapporteurs on freedom of expression, one for OSCE in Europe, one for the Inter-American system, and one for the African Commission on Human Rights. So every year the 4 of us get together and we do a kind of joint declaration on some issue. And this year we did a joint declaration on fake news, disinformation, and propaganda. And one of the things we propose is that in light of sort of the avalanche of fake information, that governments have an obligation to provide as much government data and other forms of information as they can. But we're kind of, we're creating it on the basis of existing norms, and I think our goal is to say it enough that eventually, at the Human Rights Court level and other places, they'll start to pick it up and create law that actually draws from this a positive obligation.
Okay.
So I think you're spot on this. But I also think it goes to this other question in a way, because of the nature of, particularly in health and in scientific space, and because the government funds so much, either through NIH or through projects that it funds that others are doing, there may also be an obligation that's drawn almost more from the economic, social, and cultural rights, which is about science and education, and an obligation on the state to make available scientific information, which might be a different way of framing it, not just through Article 19, but through the right to education in the ESCR. So there actually are some people doing work. We could talk a little bit about that, but there's some people doing work in that space, because I think it's important to think about government's role not just as a restrictive one, but as an enabling one. Yeah.
But what if the government is the primary perpetrator of fake news?
Well, this is a problem too. So I also think that it's useful to think about propaganda and disinformation that's government promoted as itself an interference with the right of freedom of expression, right? Because it interferes with the ability of individuals to get information. And to a certain extent, the digital age has made that interference easier than ever.
Yeah.
And that's a fundamental problem right now.
So there are two questions over here and over here, and I want to make sure that both of them get an opportunity, and then I think we do need to.
And then we'll wrap up.
I think we then
Yeah.
truly do.
Yeah.
Okay. Please go ahead.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm a student double majoring in IRG's International Relations, Global Business, and PR. And I was wondering what your take would be on, I guess, moving from the government and looking at the international community and seeing how, because every country kind of has their own view of what is fake news and what is real news. So is there a possibility, I mean, when you look at different companies taking action to trying to taking action and like filtering out fake news and real news and all of that, how would that work if every company like is in a different country and then like so I mean,
it's a great question.
I don't know how to explain it. Yeah.
No, this is a great question, and I think you're headed toward law school. There's a really fundamental question, not only for international organizations, but for the companies, right? So the companies, I think this is, if you look back at the history of their development of how they moderated or regulated content, they weren't thinking about the outside world. They were thinking about what are the constraints on us as companies that are governed by American law. But the truth is, they're not. I mean, Facebook, to be fair to Facebook, I don't think they saw themselves as a 2 billion person, community at the outset. 10 years ago, it was 20 million people were using the platform. So as it developed, they've been confronted with the fact that what regulation is possible and what might be imposed on them in the United States has a very different kind of impact when you're talking about what might be imposed from France, for example. So just as a very quick example, it's illegal in France to deny the Holocaust. I mean, just straight out, it's illegal. And Yahoo very early on was essentially sued by the government of France because of different sites that it was hosting that were Holocaust denier sites. The answer to that problem in the U.S. is really easy. The government can't regulate it. I mean, the company might decide to say we're not going to allow that, although then we can ask what standards should apply. But the rules in France are going to be different, and Yahoo lost its legal battle to when it said we don't have to observe that rule because we're American. They lost that, and I think that this is a problem that's getting worse and worse because states are increasingly putting restrictions on companies, and there are times now where companies are under an obligation in one state to allow information to be up, and they face a constraint or restriction by another state to take it down. So I mean, this is like the jurisdictional problem of the digital age. It's a real big, it's a big issue, and it's a good time to get interested in it because nobody has resolved it quite.
So our last question over here, and then
we're done.
Then we need to. I'm sorry.
No, it's great.
Question for Article 19, point number 2. Could it be used as a justification for that government should have an obligation to provide citizens access to the internet as a basic human right?
Yeah. Yeah. So yes. So there actually early in the digital age there was this big argument whether there's a human right of access to the internet, and my predecessor, who was cautious, he was usually not cautious. I mean, in a good way. But early on, he decided he wasn't going to say that, like that Article 19 provides a right to the internet. But I think that that was something in 2011. I mean, when we think about just the rapid expansion, particularly of social media, but especially search. I think search is the more important driver in terms of access to information. I think now we can say that if you lack access to the internet, you're being denied the right to exercise the rights in Article 19, And so the argument that there's a right to the internet is much more, it's much more acceptable these days. And it sort of becomes a semantic issue, whether you say there's a right to the internet or, or you say the internet is essential to enjoying the right of freedom of expression. It doesn't really, they're the same thing, and I think they're both true today. Yeah. And 19.2 gets you there.
Okay, everybody,
Thank
thank
you.
you so much.